Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Supply Chain Talk. And we're here to discuss supply chain sustainability in 2023, obviously a very topical subject. And I have three guests to join me in a moment. One of them has got technical difficulties, so I hope he'll be joining us. He may be slightly late. And as usual, the format of the episode is that we'll talk about a topical news item first of all, and then we'll move on to the main subject of supply chain sustainability. As always, there's the chat and question and answer section on your screen, so please do contribute with your comments and questions. And also, as always, we will be awarding a Supply Chain Talk mug to the contribution that we find most valuable for our discussion. So look forward to seeing those comments and questions. So let me bring on my first guest, who is Michael Bruman. And Michael is Head of Supply Chain at Community Fibre Limited, which is a London-based broadband provider that has ESG at its core. And I think what's really useful is that Mike has worked in supply chain roles for 12 years in a mix of sectors. But I think what's particularly interesting in this area of broadband is that he leads the alternative network sustainability focus, which is bringing together procurement and supply chain professionals from across the fibre broadband industry to tackle environmental issues as a group. So that'd be very interesting, I'm sure, to hear some insight from that process of I guess competitors working together for the good of some important issues. So look forward to that, and welcome, Michael. My second guest is Soraya Karimi Govanu. So I'm sure I've pronounced that wrong, Soraya, but I did my best. And she is Supply Chain Director at Smithfield Foods. Soraya's worked in the foods and drinks industry, I can see, for 14 years in a mixture of companies. And Smithfield itself is one of the largest pork manufacturers supplying food across the UK, Ireland and Europe. And I think it's interesting just to note that that's a mix of both fresh meats and deli counter type products, as well as tinned and canned and cooked meats in various formats. So quite a mixture, but an interesting business. And I think, Soraya, you mentioned yesterday how it absolutely is an end-to-end kind of supply chain of having direct control over farming, feed, as well as the actual production of the final products. So welcome. And I'm not sure if we have Lewis here, but Lewis Bourne, I will wait to see if he's appearing. I can't tell if he's going to appear. That's the issue with the technical issues. But Lewis is from Severn Trent and is the supply chain sustainability manager there. So I'll introduce him. Here he is. So he joins us from Severn Trent Water, where he's supply chain sustainability, heading up the supply chain sustainability team there. And there's a real focus on engaging with suppliers on all aspects of sustainability and to commercializing commitments. So welcome, Lewis. I'm glad you made it with slight time issues there. Good. So let's move on then to the news article this week, which is headed up that ports and shipping need to go green to resist future global crises. And this really focuses on a report from UN trade and development experts, UNCTAD, who are basically commenting on the fact that obviously, as we all appreciate, a huge amount of world trade goes via sea, 80%. And some of the issues, I think, with sustainability in particular is that the fleet is very old, in that I think the average age of vessels it mentions is now 22 years old. And they're getting older, and clearly aging vessels are going to be less environmentally friendly. So that's certainly one of the issues, and as well as the whole price pressures and the fluctuations in container prices and so on has really just shown the dependence of world trade on shipping. So in a way, it's a slight mixture of messages there to some extent in the article, but I guess given our focus is on sustainability today, interested in that sort of the green sort of points that are being raised in it. So Michael, did you want to sort of maybe kick off with your comments on that?
Yeah, I thought it was a very good article, but I think some of the some of the suggestions were maybe a little bit out there, but we have to really think outside the box. They're talking about returning to sail power, but I guess the general gist of, does it need to improve? Do the ports and the shipping industry need to improve? I think everybody needs to improve, and they're a relatively large contributor to greenhouse gases. I think we were talking yesterday around the 2.5–3% of the global emissions. So of course they have to improve. Is the answer maybe going to sail instead of engine power? I suspect not, but as they generally improve over the years, bringing in more efficient designs, more efficient engines and boat designs, and also the whole hierarchy of needs, actually reducing our reliance on the shipping industry by nearshoring rather than shipping everything halfway around the world several times over before it lands at the consumer's door. So I think yes, they do need to improve. Are they going to do it overnight? No, but it's definitely still needs to be a focus and an industry-wide focus.
Thank you, Michael. Lots of good points you've made there. Soraya, I mean, I think you were mentioning yesterday how, kind of, when we were discussing yesterday how, some products do need to be shipped. I mean, you're not going to send bananas by air, and you can't grow them in the UK. But in your perspective of the food sector, particularly, do you think the messages in this article rang true?
I do believe so, but I think very much what Michael touched on. If a vessel is average age of 22 years, it doesn't change as much as what potentially trucks, fleets would, transporting product by road. So it's very difficult because, yes, it does need to change, but you're absolutely right. Most of the shipping that happens is actually normally tires across the world, and you wouldn't be bringing them by road necessarily just because of, bulk mass, etc. So yes, we do have to continue using shipping lines and container ships, and weigh up that what do they emit compared to how much do they actually move, because you get a lot more on a ship than you would anything else. But sustainability wise, yes, something does need to change, and especially for food, sometimes you have no option but to sometimes use shipping lines if you're importing from, say, America to UK. But then other options, you might go down that road route and have a look at what's a better option for you, especially if it's perishable, like you mentioned. And if we don't grow it in the UK, it has to come sometimes by sea. So
yeah, I think it's very interesting, some of those points you both raised there, and that's the sort of relative issues of ship versus road and so on, and could you near shore? And just as I'll share a few stats, I mean, first of all, Michael mentioned that the total worldwide emissions that come from shipping are estimated to be 3%. So this isn't sort of huge. I mean, not to say it's not important, but it's not necessarily enormous. But I think what's really interesting is when you compare emissions per ton kilometre, I think it's estimated to be 3 grams for shipping and 80 grams for road. But if you put that into context of the nearshoring versus offshoring debate, it means if you drive a truckload of stuff from, say, Frankfurt, that will use as much emissions as a container coming from a similar quantity of product coming from Hong Kong or Shanghai by ship. So it just makes it quite interesting that sort of, if you drive stuff across Europe, it could be worse than actually just bringing it from ship from the other side of the world. Lewis, what's your perspective on this one?
Yeah, I think shipping is a great option for long-term haulage. As you said, it's a much lower carbon, and as Soraya said, you can get a lot more in a container. I think for us, we're often required to ship from across the world, but they're never full loads, they're never full containers. So we really want to know the individual box even, or what the carbon value of a much lower scale, rather than just an estimate on it's that particular vessel. How efficient is it in terms of the diesel that it uses? How many miles is it going? And then also, what is a box and a container worth in terms of a carbon value? I think that's where the industry needs to know to give that level of data, so that we can understand our supply chain emissions much better. But the aging vessels, I think you said 22 years, there's massive cost pressures at the moment. Obviously, I think the article alludes to the increasing cost of shipping as well. And if there's an increasing cost of shipping already, are suppliers going to pay even more to allow that company to be able to invest in their fleet? I think at the moment it would seem as though there's going to be a pretty flat line, and everybody's just trying to get by at the moment rather than invest in a low carbon fleet of long haul ships. And yeah, I agree with Michael. Ultimately, the solution is nearshoring, not requiring to ship halfway across the world, but it certainly is a good solution for bulk items.
Yeah. I think the other thing, which I don't think the article actually touched on, is there are real basics, which is just go a bit slower, and actually, just like all of us on the motorways and so on, actually cutting your speed by 10% can save quite significant fuel. And it's the same with shipping. I think if they run a little bit slower. So again, it all depends on supply and demand and capacity on that. Just perhaps running around as well. So I think we all recognise that shipping is very efficient in terms of distance and tonnage and so on, where it's appropriate. And do you think we make enough use in the UK and Europe, of alternative transport other than road? So obviously rail is one of them, but short sea shipping is another aspect which is perhaps underused. I don't know, compared to when you look on the continent and the major shipping on the canals there and rivers which go deep inland. And do you think there's more opportunity to do that? So perhaps back to you on that one, Michael.
Yeah, I guess it's I'm not suggesting that we go back to the canals and start loading up all the barges with products, but it's definitely an opportunity to look at the rail freight option. Rail freight's obviously a lot more efficient than road freight, but you can't get railways into everywhere that you need to, whereas you can with a road. So you have to kind of balance those pieces, and maybe the UK is slightly behind some of the rest of Europe with respect to its ability to utilize multiple forms of transport. So I do think there's an opportunity for it, but the initial impact of the build and the carbon from that build is probably going to offset quite a lot of the gains in the first, the early parts of any program. So I guess it comes down to making sure that we're utilizing the available network that we have today most efficiently, rather than necessarily growing a new network or building anything new into the infrastructure. So making sure that we are not transporting air, and we are backhauling wherever possible, and we are using rail freight if it's available and suitable, is probably going to be better overall than building a brand new railway that will cost us a lot of money in the first place.
Yeah, that's certainly the UK's record on building new railways is not the speediest, that's for sure. Soraya, do you have much experience in using alternative to road transport in your supply chains?
So yes, but again, very limited to the EU. So we actually do use rail freight, but we have to stop at Rotterdam because the UK doesn't have the link that we need for it to then carry on rail. So we then end up transferring back to road. So Michael's right. We as a country we are slightly behind on the infrastructure as what Europeans may be. I always wonder if rather than spending millions and millions on rail in the UK, is whether we actually invest that money looking at things that are, say, axle technology, that type of stuff, to produce those type of sustainable energy sources that could run our roads. Because in England, it's all about roads, I think, usually. And short sea shipping isn't used as much in our industry as it is. Again, everything is just get it on road. So if that is the case, how do we make that slightly better than what it is at the minute? Is my would be my thought process on that.
Yeah, no, and as you mentioned, the interconnectivity could definitely be better between the different modes. Lewis, how about you?
Yeah, I was actually at the HS2 site today, just by Euston Station, and they talked about how long it was just going to take. It's 12 years of tunnelling just to go from London to Birmingham. So when we talk about, and the cost of that as well, I think that the project's tripled, hasn't it, since its inception as well. So when we talk about rail freight being an option, I'm not sure there's the capacity there for goods to flow around the country as there is in mainland Europe as well. For us, it's about electrifying the fleet as well. Obviously, there's a big carbon footprint associated with diesel vehicles, and we have looked at HGV vehicles as well, but the technology is just not there for the battery power. I know that Tesla in America and a couple of other companies like Volta have gone and made that investment, but the trucks are really expensive. So when you look at the cost pressures at the moment, the commercials just don't stack up to be able to transition over to hauling big trucks via electric vehicles.
That's really interesting, and in fact, it ties in rather nicely just before we move on to the main subject. Well, we are moving on to the main subject, really, but actually, we've got a great question and a great comment. So the comment first is that from Carl Morgan about really talking about the release of Tesla's trucks and so on, but saying that solar powered planes or ships won't be anytime soon. But I think what you're saying, even on the trucks, it's great publicity and exciting, but just the sheer battery power needed to shift a truck for hundreds of miles is really challenging. But the question we had, which perhaps again, if let's go around you each on that one from Robert, is I think, which touches on your point, Lewis, is if we can kind of be less dependent on diesel and so on by perhaps going for electric, are there opportunities there? And again, it ties in literally just today in the news in the UK, onshore wind, certainly the UK and other countries too have got huge potential to generate a lot more electricity by green means, and therefore if we're not depending on fossil fuels, that electricity can clearly charge batteries and so on. So perhaps to start with you, Lewis. So in terms of do you think eventually we're going to get there with electric goods vehicles as well as electric cars?
Yeah, I think the technology is there. I mentioned a couple of companies, Tesla and Volta, I think are quite big in the industry, and a couple of American. I think we're waiting for the cost to come down. There's been massive innovation costs which are built into the initial vehicles, and we're just waiting for the volumes to come and for the cost to come down so it's comparable to other vehicles at the moment. But I think one of the interesting ones that we've certainly been looking at as well is hydrogen vehicles. So the problem with wind and solar is that there's peaks and troughs in demand when it's sunny or when it's windy, and our current infrastructure in the UK isn't able to support the peaks and troughs. We need something more consistent like nuclear to be able to run our grid on. But there's quite a lot of innovation projects out there in the country at the moment that are using the excess when it's a particularly windy day to then create hydrogen essentially. And obviously that's something that you don't need batteries to store. It's another alternative fuel. So then that's quite a cost neutral way and a low carbon way of creating a fuel alternative. And obviously hydrogen and engines are quite easy to convert to hydrogen. I've been told. I'm no scientist in this area as well, but the transition from combustion engines to hydrogen, I think is more of a fix or an adaptation, whereas an electric vehicle and powered by a battery is completely different technology as well. So I think that's really the interim route that we've been looking at as well.
Yeah, very really interesting points there, and I think very interesting that your insight there that the cost of the vehicles isn't so much. Is partly because they're recouping that initial R&D cost, and once the volume settles down, the costs are not so great. That's a really interesting premise there. Soraya, what do you reckon on the chances to move to different types of vehicle?
I think there's a possibility, but very much like Lewis, I think it has to be mixed. You could have the potential of certain ones electric, hydrogen, etc. Because for different businesses, so small local trucks that deliver small locally could be electric, but taking an Arctic lorry from mainland Europe into UK, you'd be charging that truck every probably 30 minutes down the road. So I do think it will be possible in the future. If it's in my working career, I'm not sure, but definitely something's coming. And Tesla, for example, lead that, don't they, in innovation? And you see that increased in mileage quite quick. I hope it would, because personally, I'd love to drive an electric Arctic lorry. I think that'd be great. But
but certainly it's a good point you made that we're seeing certainly some of the big courier companies, delivery companies are investing big time in really huge fleets of electric vehicles for that very reason, that they're doing lots and lots of very dense drops, but the total mileage they do in a day is really not that huge. And of course, in an urban environment, particularly the stopping and starting in electric doesn't really matter. In fossil fuels, it matters a lot more. But so it is. Yeah, it's the right equipment for the right job. Michael, anything you wanted to add on that?
Well, just a couple of things. I guess Tesla was only really released its first car maybe 12, 14 years ago, and look how far the developments come there. So I don't think we should write off some major changes in the transport industry in the next 10, 15 years. I think they could well be on their way, but I think everyone's touched on the fact that it might not be through electric battery technology, maybe through hydrogen. But I saw a article on the German e-highway where Scania are developing some trucks with pantographs. So the electricity, the power isn't actually stored. They do have a small battery and they have a hybrid engine. So if they need to overtake someone, they come off of the pantograph like when they indicate out, pull out, engine turns on, they overtake someone, they pull back in. And then that removes the demand is really the battery size and the battery capacity. If you can take the power supply away from the truck, and like a train driving down the train tracks, the power comes from the pantograph overhead. I think obviously the cost and the implication of developing that across the whole of Europe is ginormous, but we've got to find some of these gains from somewhere. German's e-highway, I think they're expanding it by several kilometers a year. Doesn't sound a lot, but if you can start to reduce the demand on from trucks, that can also help. So I guess it's just thinking outside the box and not just saying, well, we have to put the engine in the truck and we have to put the battery in the truck. We can do some clever things to separate those two out.
Yeah, no, some great examples there. Thanks, Michael, for raising those ones. Absolutely. Let's move then to the main topic now. Well, we're already on it, which is, and the first point there was about planning for a sustainable supply chain, the profit pros and cons. So I guess there are some initiatives that you get profit by doing them anyway. You want to schedule your transport as efficiently as possible, fill your vehicles as efficiently as possible, and that not only saves emissions, but it saves you vehicle running costs and so on. So there's some things like that, but I guess there's others where you really are making the decision that to be sustainable is going to be more costly, and can you afford to do that with the current cost pressures? So perhaps Lewis, do you want to sort of start there? Have you faced some of those decisions of thinking, look, I'm going to have to justify this to my management to say, look, we've got to spend more because it's the only way we can be sustainable?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I talk about, we spend obviously a considerable sum in construction, but we also spend it elsewhere in chemicals and in other services that we buy. But yeah, absolutely. If we were to go to and receive bids from a supplier to say that we were going to do it with a low concrete solution option, which is slightly more of an expensive commodity, then yeah, absolutely, we see those cost pressures. But really, it's about the values of the company as well. Particularly, we've seen that we have to think differently as well. So for an example, if we are talking about a large construction project, if we really look at how much concrete we need and look at other alternatives, like there's new solutions like a rolled concrete mat, so that you don't have to wet concrete. It's just a mat that might line and do the same job in a reservoir, for example. Or we look at our waste and where we could save money elsewhere on the project as well, and whether we could trade and use other materials as well. So it means that you come in at a project or at a procurement activity from a different lens. You might not get to the solution where it is a lower commercial value, but you may be able to do different things in waste in the local society or in terms of reducing your carbon footprint as well. So yeah, I don't think there's a definite answer to that question, and there's compromises across the board.
Thank you. Soraya, how about you? Have you faced sort of decisions where you've really got to justify a higher cost to be more sustainable?
I think the key experience for us was again using rail freight. It isn't a cheaper option for us, but the emissions is a lot lower than what it would have been, for example, via road. So that's something as a business we decided, because sustainability is key, and it isn't just about you sustaining your business and the environment. It's also consumers now want you to show them that you are more conscious on your carbon footprint, what you are doing to make sure that the planet is sustainable. So as a kind of business, we decided that is key for us to make sure that not only are we sustainable as a business, but our consumers are happy customers and we're doing our part. And just to touch on a bit that kind of Lewis, was speaking about, there are pros and cons because, for example, packaging costs for reduced plastic, they might be a fraction more expensive, but then plastic tax kind of impact could then be lower for your business. So there is that whole, might have to output a slightly more at the beginning, but at the end you might benefit. And there is definitely a compromise on which to do. But I believe as businesses, we have to be conscious of what our customers and consumers are looking for now. And they're definitely a lot more into the environment and sustainability, and our carbon footprints that we do.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and that there's a lot of factors to consider, and if you can, perhaps market research and whatever, or consumer research shows that we think that could contribute to sort of 1 or 2% more sales growth than otherwise if we weren't so sustainable, and there's other factors that you can bring into the business case. And Michael, really interested to hear, we particularly with the alternative network that mentioned at the beginning when introducing you, when you're looking more as a whole industry where you can work together as an industry, does that open up more opportunities to tackle the profit issue when you're going for sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a prime example is where we've approached one of our manufacturers to say, can we take out some of the packaging material and some of the instructions that we don't need in every single box that gets sent, because that's our engineers that are installing it. You'd be a bit worried if they started reading the instructions in your house whilst they're installing your broadband. And the answers were back as it's going to cost us more money because we're being different to everybody else. But actually, if you get your industry focus groups to put the pressure up and say, well, we're not going to be different from everybody else. Everybody's going to take the same step forward of, let's get rid of the excess packaging waste. Let's get rid of the excess printing and instruction leaflets. And, there was rule plugs that were sent with every single one that we don't use, and put the pressure on as an industry group. I think we'll see those costs be eliminated and actually come down. So instead of costing us more to be different, hopefully it will cost us less to all be the same, because we won't be spending the money on the printing and on the packaging. And obviously, back to the argument we had earlier, it will be less weight, less size. We can fit more into a container, less CO2 per unit shipped. So it has all the benefits that we really want to see.
Yeah, those are some fantastic examples, actually, as you say, that by acting as an industry, whereas if you're one customer asking for something, oh dear, well, that's different. However big a customer you are, it's now I've got to have two versions of the same product. So that's a great example of the power of working together. And the sort of second point in terms of the kind of the agenda is the impact of not delivering a sustainable supply chain. Is it worth the change? So I guess actually, perhaps Soraya, coming back to the point you mentioned about, in a way, the customer pressure, the fact that whether it's a business customer or I guess in your case it's more the B2B customer, but in other businesses it's the consumer as well. So that, I guess, is one example where if you don't do anything and your competitors are, you're going to start looking pretty poor and potentially lose sales. Is that quite a factor in the meat and food sector?
I've seen it a lot more of the last few years, where customers have said, you must, for example, have clear matte packaging because we don't wish to have, say, a coloured tray anymore because they're not as recyclable as what clear is. Or you'll have them say, you must change by this point, otherwise we will not facilitate that product. And a lot of the big major retailers have this view of they will have a set date of when they wish to be, carbon neutral, or all these different targets that they set, and they engage you very early to get you on board as well. So you are absolutely right. You then risk potentially listing a product with a customer if you don't hit their brief on what they want. So.
So okay, that's quite a positive way then, where the retailers, the big supermarkets, who can be a bit sort of viewed as really as misusing their power sometimes, but in this case it's perhaps a good use of their clout, that they can really insist on things to all their suppliers and make things happen. Lewis, in your sector, I mean, I guess we always sort of think with something like a water company that no one's got much choice. If you're a Severn water area, that's who's going to provide your water. So
yeah, well, it's true.
You have less pressure to worry about these things.
It's true. We're in a monopoly business, so you don't have choice. But we're really heavily regulated, probably more so, both economically and from an environmental point of view as well. And as part of that, we have to extensively survey our customers. And obviously, I think we've got around 8.2. And I think over the year, we survey and have contact with around 500,000 of those. Wow. So it's a really extensive customer research that we're required to undertake. And their number one priority is sustainability. But we reflected that quite a few years ago. I think we spoke yesterday, Alistair. We set a science-based target. So different from a net zero, more stringent, aligned to the 1.5 degree pathway, and only limited amount of offsets required. And as part of that science-based target, we're also have set an engagement target with our supply chain, which means we've committed to sign up 70% of our supply chain by emissions to a science-based target as well by 26. So we've been really quite hardcore in this area in terms of taking ownership as ourselves to reduce our internal emissions, the fuel that we use and the emissions from our operations, but also only working with suppliers moving forward who agree to align with that, because that's what the customers want ultimately.
Great, thank you. And Michael, again, in your sector, what would be the impact of not doing anything?
Yeah, I think the last decade has been where sustainability could be seen as a competitive advantage. It's something that that not every customer is after, but those that can do it well, attract the customers that are particularly interested in buying sustainably and working with local companies. But I think next decade we'll see that advantage shift towards just competitive parity. You have to do it in order to compete in any of the markets, whether that the water, the telco market. And if you don't, then you probably won't attract the same investment from investors and also the same customer demand. So I do think that's the real shift that we're going to see, where in the past it's been something that people have been actively seeking out and going after, and now it's something they expect. So it's a bit of a hygiene factor that they expect to be buying from companies that trade ethically and that do their best to reduce their carbon footprint. So the failing to do that, you're going to lose customers who not just customers who are specifically going after companies that, or going to trade with companies that are sustainable, but I think you'll lose a lot more than that. You'll lose the normal customers as they become more and more caring about the environment. And also then, as I say, you're going to lose potentially investors who are going to back that part of your business.
Yeah, okay. And perhaps just one other dimension, and it relates a little bit actually to next week's episode, which I will cover when we close off. But in terms of sort of staff retention and staff recruitment, I mean, is that starting to become more of a thing where people, do you ever pick that up? I don't know, Soraya, in your company, do you ever pick up the fact that it's a positive to be seen as a sustainable business that's striving for the most sustainable methods of farming and produce production? Is that something that helps on staff retention and has an impact in recruitment when we're in such competition in the labour market?
I definitely think there's an element to it, yes. We do highly promote that we feed the nation sustainably, and that's how we always like to be. We also have a lot of other impacts that people ask about, from sustainability to welfare of animals, etc., as well as things like charity donations and that kind of stuff. So it's definitely been spoken about before, and I think it's a very good perception to give, to show people that you actually do care. And people like that nowadays, to know that they work for a business that cares about the environment, cares about what they do, and is looking for ways to continue to grow the business, but do it in a very kind of well-managed way and not impact the environment or other people as well. So.
And perhaps if I sort of just reverse the order, Michael, going back to you, I mean, obviously community fibre, as you say, very much with ESG at its core. So I guess that is it's just the heart of what you do, and presumably that also helps with your staff retention and recruitment, because people like to work in a company with
it certainly attracts employees that are interested in ESG and in sustainability. But a good example is we have a weekly update, company-wide update from our CEO Graham, and at the end of that he asks if anyone's got any questions. And when you have a company-wide update with hundreds of employees on it, not many people ask many questions. A couple of weeks ago, he did an update on our sustainability and the green team and what the work they had been doing. and we had so much engagement from the whole business. So people are really passionate about it, and it really brought people out, talking and asking questions that normally would have just stayed off camera, sitting in the background, listening to the update, and then gone off and carried on with their day. So it really does bring out a certain level of attachment and engagement and values of employees. And I think every company can benefit from that. Yes, we're community fiber, we've got community in our name, we have values that match that, but every company can benefit from engaging with their employees and getting involved in the values that match with their employees' values.
Yeah, thank you. And Lewis in Severn Trent is
yeah. I think there's quite a lot of polls and research on this, particularly on Glassdoor. I think I've read on that the two main factors are sustainability and flexible working for people at the moment. So obviously, post-COVID, working from home and having that flexibility, and obviously with family life as well, but also working for a company with I suppose a moral compass or a moral direction under the sustainability banner as well. And we've certainly found that as well, that it's a question, particularly in the sort of the sub 30 age category as well. It's really important for people to come in and know if they're going to start a career with a company that it's on the right trajectory under the sustainability banner.
Yeah, great. Becoming so important in every way. So moving to the third point, which is, can multi-tier supply chain networks be entirely sustainable? And actually, I'll just bring in as well, to that point, Robert's asked another interesting question about what sort of support do your respective suppliers give you to help you achieve your sustainability goals and mitigate impact and so on. So I guess that whole question, as soon as you're into a multi-tier supply chain network, working with your suppliers and knowing what they're doing is really important. And perhaps, Lewis, if I just carry on stay with you for a moment, because I know you mentioned, the ability to measure what your suppliers are doing is really important as part of managing a sustainable multi-tier network. So do you want to share a little bit of that?
So as part of our science-based target, the engagement target I spoke to you previously about, we're requiring our suppliers to set quite an ambitious reduction target. But in order to do so, they're required to baseline their emissions and understand how that impacts on their supply chain as well. And if you are not familiar with that before, which really most of our suppliers weren't a couple of years ago when we embarked on that, we had to support them massively in terms of education. So we've run loads of training exercises. We partnered with an organization called the Supply Chain Sustainability School. It's sort of a free training, e-learning and online webinars, lunch and learns, etc. on all topics, sort of the 21 topics of sustainability that come under the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But equally, we recognized that there needed to be a system for us to objectively measure that. So when we talk about supplier selection and procurement, we needed to have something quantitative to fall back on. So the EcoVadis system we launched in January this year, it's a collaborative process. So it's an assessment of how sustainable that supplier is, but we're not using that as a stick to beat them with. It's more, where have you started and how can we get you to a better place? It sort of spits out what's called a corrective action plan to understand, do you need an anti-bribery and corruption policy? Do you need to look at your fuel and energy usage? Are you particularly high in your company waste, etc.? And then we sort of consult with them to help them move to be a more sustainable supply chain. And that's the only way that we found feasibly that we can help our suppliers. If you just dump a responsibility on and just say, we need this to happen, it's a really negative way of getting a message on, and it's going to be much slower for you to be able to achieve what you need to. Whereas if you work with them, give them the tools and the expertise as well to be able to help them, they're more bought into the idea. And as Michael said, that some of them are twigging that it's also a competitive advantage. If you go early with sustainability as a supplier, you can also sell that to other companies as well.
That's great. Yeah, so that's really interesting, that really collaborative approach, and the education as part of it to kick things off almost. That's really interesting perspective there. And Soraya, I know that you mentioned how your supply chain is managing right through from the animal feed through to the farming, through to the production and the packaging, and then ultimately to your product. So certainly a real multi-tier supply chain there. So how do you sort of ensure that is truly sustainable?
So initially we started off with our kind of mission statement as a business, but we also have to consider, I guess, is what level are certain people at. I guess, as Lewis touched on, we vary from having family-run businesses that we use as suppliers to multi-billion-pound logistics companies across Europe. So everyone's going to be at a different point, but we always offer that support of how can we help you, how can we assist, and we make sure that our sustainability message is free for them to then be able to use and have the support there if required. But I do think when it's multi-tiered, it can be quite difficult because everyone's at a different position to the other. But as long as we are supporting and helping each other, I think that's quite a key thing to kind of work on. As an example, for us in the UK, we recently did business with a supplier of a warehouse, and speaking to them on how do they get sustainability, we took their message and ended up finding that they had solar paneled the whole 70,000 pallet storage warehouse. And it's one of those things of going, right, what are you guys doing? So what can we also do? Because then it shows that we're collaborating well with them. We've got a partnership with them now. So it's, I guess, trying to get information from those who are ahead of you and supporting those who are slightly behind you to catch up.
That's a great example as well, because actually, again, it relates a little bit, Michael, with what you're doing, where you're obviously exchanging ideas and developing kind of joint solutions across the industry. But I guess the other aspect of this is it's interesting, Soraya, that you're saying that obviously in some cases you're the big customer to a small supplier, an independent family farm. In other cases, you're a small customer to a major logistics company who are going to probably dwarf you in scale. So Michael, do you come across that much? I mean, I'm not sure how big community fiber is. Are you sometimes the small fish, or are you sometimes the big fish who can call the shots?
Yeah, very much a combination of both. Where we're working with some of our supply chain and asking them to measure, and there's some of them have nothing in place. They have never measured their carbon footprint before. Some of them you ask them and they share with you their 58-page PDF report where it's got every single bit of information that you're ever going to need. And obviously, exactly as Soraya said, where you can pull information from or pull best practices from other people and try and implement yourself, and also then sharing them with the rest of your supply chain. So it is a combination of both. And I think it's to answer the question in a short sentence, it's a very complex piece to have a multi-tier supply chain, and I don't think it's going to be easy to get fully sustainable across your full supply chain in any industry. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to do so.
Absolutely. Well, we covered a huge variety of points there, so what I'm going to ask you as a final question is what would be your priority or the most important issue to focus on? So should we start with you, Lewis? What is your top priority in this area?
It's definitely, as Michael alluded to, it's a really complicated area to ask suppliers to give you their carbon data. And obviously, we would love to know, for example, we buy a lot of water meters. So the individual environmental product declaration is the standard. So we really want to get to a point where for every commodity, be that concrete, aggregate, meters, etc., that a supplier is able to provide us with the individual environmental product declaration. And then also for us, where would we house all of that data as well? Because that's an inordinate amount of data. But to keep up with the GHG requirements of carbon reporting, and if we're really going to be putting sustainability and particularly carbon reduction at the forefront of the business, we need to get those data points. But for us, we're having a look at what software system can house that, because this is a massive data stream coming in that you really don't want to set up a manual process in 2023. So yeah, that's the big issue for us at the moment that we're grappling with.
Okay, thank you. Soraya, what's your sort of biggest area of focus, biggest issue?
I kind of wanted to say data, but Lewis has kind of touched on that. So definitely data is a key element, because you can't do anything unless you know where you're starting from. I think for us, because there's so many tiers, and like we said, such a different in variety of massive companies to small, it's making sure that everyone's doing something to improve their sustainability and to show that they're working towards something for the future. And having their engagement is key for us, and that's what we're trying to do at the moment. So dealing with UK warehouses to Polish hauliers to Lithuanian hauliers, etc., is making sure that they're all on the same page as we are in improving sustainability going forward. So that's our key focus for 23, is get that engagement with everyone.
Great, thank you. And finally, Michael.
I think it needs to be transparency from across the supply chain, which is similar to how Lewis talked about it. I think if everyone focuses on, collecting their data, it's the old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So making sure that everyone collects their data on their emissions, scope 1 and 2, and then that means that you can easily see your whole supply chain's emissions. If we don't start somewhere by measuring, then we're definitely not going to be able to see where we can improve.
Great, thank you very much. Well, really some fantastic insights there, and really great to have the experience of 3 such different industries, and we can see some real sort of common features and common approaches which can be very effective. So thank you both. Thank you all 3 of you for your contributions. In terms of the contributions from our audience, thank you. I saw other comments flowing as well. So as always, sorry we couldn't get around to all of them. But Robert, thank you for your 2 excellent questions. So Robert Jones, a Supply Chain Talk mug will be on its way to you. And just before we close, a reminder that our next episode is on the 14th of December, so Wednesday week, today week at 4 p.m. And that one focuses on the supply chain skills shortage, retaining and developing your talent. So definitely a big challenge in our industries at the moment. So thank you once again, Michael Bruman, Head of Supply Chain at Community Fibre Limited, Soraya Karimi Guvanyu, Supply Chain Director at Smithfield Foods, and Lewis Bourne, Supply Chain Sustainability Manager at Severn Trent. So thank you for joining us today, and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in the audience next week on Wednesday. Thank you. Goodbye.